Edward Cole always hated mornings because mornings carried proof that time only moved in one direction for everyone except him. Every night at exactly 11:17 p.m., no matter where he was or what he was doing, tomorrow arrived inside his mind like a storm tearing through a locked room. It lasted 1 minute. 60 unbearable seconds filled with fragments of the next day. Faces. Voices. Headlines. Blood on sidewalks. Lottery numbers. Conversations that had not happened yet. The smell of rain before clouds even formed. At first, when he was 12 years old, he believed the visions were dreams. Then his teacher died exactly the way he had seen. Then his mother dropped a coffee mug exactly 3 seconds after saying the same sentence he had already heard in his head the night before. By the time he turned 25, Edward understood the terrible truth. He was cursed with tomorrow. He lived in a small apartment in Chicago above a laundromat that smelled like bleach and heat. He worked nights repairing old radios and cassette players in a repair shop owned by a tired Armenian man named Levon who never asked personal questions. Edward preferred it that way because people became dangerous once they realized he knew things he should not know. Years ago he tried warning strangers about accidents. Sometimes he saved them. Sometimes he only changed the details while the outcome remained the same. A man avoided a car crash and later died choking in a restaurant bathroom. A woman canceled a flight Edward warned her about and was murdered during a robbery the following week. Tomorrow seemed determined to collect its debt. After enough failures, Edward stopped playing hero. He stopped dating. Stopped making long-term plans. Stopped caring about birthdays or holidays because every joy carried the taste of future grief. At 11:17 p.m. on a cold October night, Edward sat alone on the roof of his building smoking a cigarette while the city glowed below him like electric veins beneath skin. His watch ticked closer to the minute he feared most. 11:17 arrived. The world froze. The cigarette stopped burning. The wind stopped moving. Then tomorrow entered him. He saw a subway station filled with screaming people. A little girl holding a yellow balloon. A man in a gray coat reaching inside his jacket. A gunshot. Panic. Blood splattering across white tile walls. Edward gasped as the vision ended. Time returned violently. The cigarette burned his fingers. Somewhere below, a siren wailed through the streets. Edward stood frozen while his heartbeat pounded against his ribs. This one felt different. Clearer. Longer. Usually his visions came as disconnected fragments, but this had structure. Detail. Meaning. He looked at the clock. The shooting would happen tomorrow evening around 6 p.m. He knew the station too. Monroe Station. Downtown. Hundreds of people passed through it every hour. Edward crushed the cigarette beneath his shoe and tried convincing himself to ignore it. He had learned the cost of interference. Tomorrow hated being changed. Yet the image of the little girl refused to leave his mind. Yellow balloon. Brown curls. Terrified eyes. He barely slept. The next day crawled forward like a prisoner walking toward execution. At work, Levon noticed Edward's trembling hands. "You look dead already," the old man muttered without looking up from a broken radio. Edward forced a smile. Just tired. By 5:20 p.m. he was standing outside Monroe Station watching crowds pour underground. Businessmen. Students. Couples. Homeless men wrapped in coats. Somewhere inside that endless river of strangers was the little girl. Edward considered walking away at least 6 times. Every instinct screamed at him to let fate happen untouched. Then he saw the yellow balloon floating above the crowd near the station entrance. His stomach turned cold. The girl walked beside her mother laughing about something Edward could not hear. They disappeared into the station. Edward followed. The underground air smelled like metal and electricity. His pulse accelerated as he searched faces. Then he spotted him. Gray coat. Black gloves. Nervous eyes. The man stood near the platform edge pretending to read a newspaper. Edward moved instantly. Not because he was brave. Because he was tired of being afraid. He slammed into the man before the gun could leave the coat pocket. The newspaper fell. The pistol clattered across the platform. People screamed. Someone tackled the gunman from behind. Police officers nearby rushed toward the chaos. The little girl cried while clutching her balloon. Edward backed away breathlessly as commuters stared at him like he was either a hero or a lunatic. Then something terrifying happened. The gunman looked directly at Edward while officers dragged him away. And he smiled. "You shouldn't have changed it," the man whispered. Edward felt ice spread through his veins because the gunman spoke with the calm certainty of someone who already knew tomorrow too. Edward did not wait for the police to question him. The moment officers surrounded the gunman and the crowd collapsed into frightened confusion, he slipped toward the station stairs with his head lowered and his heartbeat hammering against his skull. Outside, the evening air hit him like freezing water. His hands shook so badly he could barely light a cigarette. The city continued moving as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Taxis honked. Steam rose from sewer grates. Neon signs flickered against wet pavement. Somewhere underground, reporters and police were already building a story around the incident, probably calling it an attempted mass shooting stopped by a brave civilian. Edward knew better. Tomorrow was never that simple. He walked aimlessly through downtown for nearly an hour, replaying the gunman's final words again and again. "You shouldn't have changed it." The sentence carried no anger. No panic. It sounded like a warning. Or worse, a certainty. Edward reached his apartment shortly before midnight. He locked the door, shut the curtains, and poured whiskey into a cracked glass even though he rarely drank anymore. Alcohol dulled the edges of the vision sometimes. Not enough to stop them, but enough to make sleep possible afterward. He sat in darkness staring at the digital clock beside his couch. 11:16 p.m. His stomach tightened. Every night he feared what tomorrow would show him. But tonight fear carried a different shape. If another person could see the future too, then Edward was no longer alone in the nightmare. The clock changed. 11:17 p.m. Silence swallowed the room. The whiskey stopped moving inside the glass. The city outside froze. Then tomorrow arrived. Edward saw a hallway filled with fluorescent hospital lights. He saw a television screen displaying his own face beneath the word Subway Hero. He saw the gray-coated gunman sitting calmly inside an interrogation room while blood ran from his nose. Then the vision shifted violently. A woman screamed. A car exploded beside a crowded sidewalk. Fire swallowed the night. Edward saw himself reflected in a storefront window seconds before the blast. Then the future ended. Time returned with brutal force. Edward gasped so hard whiskey spilled across his hand. He stared at the clock. 1 minute past midnight. Someone was going to die tomorrow night. Maybe several people. And somehow he was connected to it. He barely slept. By morning his face looked pale and hollow in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes like bruises. He turned on the television while making coffee. Every channel carried the same story. Unknown man prevents downtown subway tragedy. Security footage showed Edward tackling the gunman. Reporters called him courageous. Social media called him mysterious because he disappeared before police identified him. Edward turned the television off immediately. Attention was dangerous. Attention changed things. Around noon, someone knocked on his apartment door. Edward froze. Nobody visited him. He approached silently and looked through the peephole. A woman stood outside wearing a black coat and holding a leather folder beneath one arm. Mid-30s. Sharp eyes. Professional posture. Not police. Mr. Cole, she called calmly. I know you're inside. Edward opened the door halfway without removing the chain lock. Who are you? Detective Lena Vasquez. She held up a badge. Chicago Police Department. I'd like to ask you a few questions about yesterday. Edward almost closed the door immediately. But something about her expression stopped him. She looked tired rather than aggressive. Curious rather than suspicious. I already gave my statement, he lied. No, she said quietly. You vanished before officers reached you. Silence stretched between them. Finally Edward removed the chain and let her inside. Lena studied the apartment with quick observant eyes. Old books. Radio parts. Half-finished cigarettes in an ashtray. The exhausted atmosphere of a man surviving rather than living. You tackled an armed man without hesitation, she said. Most people freeze. Edward shrugged. Instinct. Interesting instinct. She opened the folder. Inside were photographs from the subway station. Because witnesses say you were staring directly at him before he even reached for the weapon. Edward said nothing. Lena leaned forward slightly. The gunman's name is Daniel Mercer. Former mathematics professor. No criminal history. No political affiliations. No clear motive. Edward's pulse accelerated at the name. Mercer. During interrogation, Lena continued, he refused to answer most questions. Except one. She removed another photograph. This one showed words scratched into the interrogation table with what looked like a broken fingernail. Edward felt cold immediately. The message read, he sees tomorrow too. Lena watched Edward carefully. Do you know what that means? Edward forced himself not to react. No. Then why do you suddenly look terrified? Before Edward could answer, the lights inside the apartment flickered once. Twice. Then the television turned on by itself. Static filled the screen. Both of them stared at it in silence. Slowly, an image emerged through the static. A subway platform. Empty. Dark. Then a face appeared close to the camera. Daniel Mercer. Blood dripped from his nose while he smiled directly into the screen. "You can't stop it forever, Edward," he said calmly. "Tomorrow belongs to something older than us." The screen went black. Lena stood frozen. Edward's blood turned to ice because he understood something horrifying in that moment. The message had not been recorded. It had not happened yet. He had just watched Tomorrow early. Lena Vasquez did not speak for nearly 10 seconds after the television went black. The silence inside the apartment felt unnatural, dense enough to suffocate. Edward could hear the ancient refrigerator humming in the kitchen and distant traffic outside 6 floors below, but the room itself seemed frozen between 2 moments in time. Lena slowly turned toward him. Her expression had changed completely. The skepticism was gone. In its place stood something more dangerous. Belief. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. Edward looked away first because he had spent most of his life avoiding exactly this moment. Once somebody believed him, everything became unstable. Relationships turned into interrogations. Curiosity turned into obsession. Fear followed shortly afterward. "You should leave," he muttered. Lena ignored him. "That video wasn't possible." "I know." "Was it a threat?" Edward laughed once without humor. "Not exactly." She stepped closer. "Then explain it." Edward walked toward the window and stared down at the glowing streets of Chicago. Rain had started falling lightly across the city, covering neon reflections with silver ripples. For years he had promised himself he would never tell another person the truth again. The last time he trusted someone ended in disaster. But now Mercer existed. A second man connected to Tomorrow. Maybe more than one. The rules were changing. Edward lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. Every night at exactly 11:17 p.m., he said quietly, "I see pieces of the next day." Lena said nothing. Not dreams. Not guesses. Real things. Conversations. Deaths. Accidents. Sometimes small things. Sometimes terrible things. She stared at him carefully as if deciding whether he was insane. "You expect me to believe that?" Edward exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "No. But you already do." That irritated her because it was true. She crossed her arms tightly. "Then tell me something about tomorrow." Edward shook his head immediately. "It doesn't work that way." "Convenient. You think I enjoy this?" His voice rose suddenly. "You think knowing the future makes life easier?" "It ruins everything." Lena remained calm, but her eyes softened slightly. Edward rarely lost control around people. Years of isolation had taught him emotional silence. Yet exhaustion weakened him. There are rules, he continued quietly. At least I think there are. The future resists change. Sometimes small things can move. Most times the outcome still finds another path. Lena pulled a chair away from the table and sat slowly. You're saying fate corrects itself? Edward nodded. A man avoids one accident and dies another way. A woman escapes a robbery and gets hit by a bus the next morning. Tomorrow adapts. Rain intensified outside. The room darkened beneath the gray afternoon sky. Lena studied Edward's face for signs of deception but found only fatigue carved deep into human form. And Mercer, she asked finally. He's like you. Edward swallowed hard. Maybe. Lena leaned back in the chair. There's more. Edward hesitated because there was one part he never shared with anyone. The part that frightened him most. Sometimes, he said slowly, the visions change after I interfere. Meaning. Meaning tomorrow watches back. Lena frowned. Edward crushed the cigarette into the ashtray. The first few years the visions were simple. Passive. Like watching scenes through a window. But after I started changing things, they became stranger. More personal. As if something noticed me noticing it. Lena opened her mouth to reply when Edward suddenly stiffened. A sharp pain exploded behind his eyes. He grabbed the edge of the table as dizziness crashed through him. What is it? Edward's breathing quickened. This had never happened during daylight before. Images flashed violently across his mind. A wet street. Screaming tires. Lena standing beside a black sedan. Blood spraying across glass. Edward gasped and stumbled backward. Move, he shouted instantly. Lena rose in confusion. What? Get away from the window now. Something in his voice convinced her. She moved just as a deafening explosion shattered the apartment wall. Glass erupted inward like a hurricane of knives. The window disintegrated. Both of them hit the floor while gunfire ripped through the room from the building across the street. Edward crawled behind the couch, dragging Lena down with him. Bullets tore through plaster above their heads. Lena pulled her pistol instantly. Sniper, she hissed. Edward's pulse thundered. This was impossible. He had never received visions in the middle of the day. Never. More gunshots blasted through the apartment. Shelves exploded into splinters. The television shattered. Somewhere outside people screamed. Lena risked a quick glance above the couch. 6th floor opposite building, she snapped. Dark jacket. Rifle. Edward tried forcing himself to think through the panic. Mercer. It had to be Mercer. Or someone connected to him. The attack stopped suddenly. Silence returned except for distant sirens beginning to rise through the city. Lena carefully stood and peered through the ruined window. He's gone. Edward remained frozen on the floor because another realization had begun spreading through him like poison. The daytime vision had saved Lena's life. Which meant the ability was evolving. Or getting worse. Lena turned toward him slowly. Tiny cuts from broken glass marked her face. "You knew," she whispered. Edward looked up at her with genuine fear in his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "I think tomorrow is getting closer." Police flooded the building within minutes. Officers stormed hallways. Detectives sealed the street below with yellow tape. Neighbors gathered in frightened clusters wearing robes and winter coats while paramedics checked Edward and Lena for injuries. Edward answered questions automatically without hearing most of them. His mind remained trapped inside one terrifying realization. The visions were changing. For nearly 20 years the ability obeyed strict patterns. 1 minute. 1 day ahead. Always at 11:17 p.m. Predictable in its cruelty. But now tomorrow had broken its own rules. Lena sat beside him in the back of an ambulance while rain hammered the roof overhead. Tiny cuts along her cheekbone glimmered beneath fluorescent emergency lights. She watched Edward carefully as if seeing him for the first time. "You saw the sniper seconds before he fired," she said quietly. Edward nodded once. "That never happened before." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Lena leaned back against the metal wall. "Then maybe stress triggered it." Edward almost laughed. "You think this works like adrenaline?" "I think there's a lot you don't understand yet." Edward looked away because she was right. The worst part of his curse had always been ignorance. He could see tomorrow, but he never knew why. No voice explained the rules. No pattern fully revealed itself. He was a man drowning in an ocean while briefly glimpsing the waves before they crashed over him. An officer approached the ambulance window. "Detective Vasquez," he said, "we found something in the opposite building." Lena stepped out into the rain with Edward close behind. They crossed the street toward an abandoned office complex facing Edward's apartment. Inside, broken concrete and mold covered the empty rooms. Police flashlights sliced through darkness. They reached the 6th floor where officers stood around a folding chair positioned beside a shattered window. A rifle rested on the floor nearby. But no shooter remained. Only a cassette tape sitting neatly on the chair. Edward's stomach tightened instantly. Lena picked it up carefully. "Who still uses tapes?" one officer muttered. Edward answered before thinking. "Someone who wants to be remembered." Back at the police station, they found an old tape player in evidence storage. Lena inserted the cassette while Edward stood silently beside her desk. Static crackled through the speakers for several seconds. Then Mercer's voice emerged calm and clear. "If you're hearing this, then Edward Cole is already frightened enough to listen." Lena and Edward exchanged tense glances. Mercer continued. "You believe your ability is unique because isolation makes people arrogant. But there have always been others. Men and women who touched tomorrow by accident. Most went insane. Some disappeared. A few learned the truth." Edward felt his pulse accelerate. "The future is not a river," Mercer said. "It is a predator. It observes those who observe it. Every vision changes you. Every interference allows it closer." Edward understands this better than most, even if he refuses to admit it. The tape crackled briefly. "Tell me, Edward. Have the visions started bleeding into daylight yet?" Lena looked sharply toward him. Edward said nothing. Mercer laughed softly through the speaker. Of course they have. That means it sees you now. The room felt colder suddenly. Officers nearby continued working without noticing the fear growing between Edward and Lena. What does that mean? Lena whispered. Mercer answered almost as if hearing her. There are stages. First you see tomorrow. Then tomorrow sees you. Eventually the barrier dissolves completely. Silence followed for several seconds before Mercer spoke again, quieter this time. You saved people at Monroe Station. That was your mistake. Fate tolerates observation. It punishes interference. Edward clenched his jaw. Enough riddles, Lena muttered. Then the tape changed. Mercer's voice vanished. A new sound emerged instead. Breathing. Slow and uneven. Edward felt every muscle in his body tighten because he recognized the breathing instantly. His own. Then a voice spoke directly into the recording. Edward's voice. Don't trust her. Lena stared at him in shock. Edward looked equally horrified. I never recorded this. The tape continued. If she stays near you, she dies on Thursday. Lena stepped backward slowly. Thursday is tomorrow, she whispered. Edward grabbed the tape player and stopped it violently. The room fell silent again except for distant phones ringing across the station. Lena's expression hardened beneath confusion and fear. You need to tell me everything, she said. Edward shook his head. I already told you more than I ever should. Someone just used your voice to predict my death. You think I understand this? Lena lowered her voice. Maybe Mercer is manipulating you. Edward looked at her carefully. Or maybe he's telling the truth. Rain continued battering the station windows while exhaustion dragged at Edward's mind like chains. He realized something then. For the first time in years, he was no longer afraid only for himself. Tomorrow had reached beyond him. It was pulling other people into the darkness around his life. Lena studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Where would Mercer go? Edward hesitated because the answer arrived instantly inside his mind, not as a vision but as instinct. Somewhere underground, he said quietly. Somewhere time got trapped. Lena frowned. That doesn't mean anything. Edward looked toward the rain-covered city outside the station windows. It will. Then every light inside the police station shut off at once. Darkness swallowed the building. Somewhere deep in the blackness, a man began laughing. Darkness consumed the police station so completely that for one disorienting second Edward felt as if the world itself had vanished. Computer monitors died. Hallway lights blinked out. The constant electric hum disappeared beneath a suffocating silence. Then came the confusion. Officers shouted across rooms. Chairs scraped violently against tile floors. Somewhere a woman screamed after dropping a glass coffee pot that shattered like gunfire. Lena instantly grabbed Edward's arm. Stay close. Emergency backup lights flickered weakly to life a few seconds later, washing the station in deep red shadows that made every face look wounded. The atmosphere changed immediately. People stopped resembling police officers and started resembling frightened animals trapped underground. Then the laughter returned. Calm. Male. Echoing somewhere through the building's ventilation system. Edward felt cold spread across his spine because he recognized the voice. Mercer. Good evening, the voice said through hidden speakers. Officers reached for weapons instantly. You're all looking in the wrong direction. Lena cursed beneath her breath and moved toward the nearest hallway. Edward followed. The laughter echoed again. Detective Vasquez, Mercer continued, Thursday arrives sooner than you think. Find the source, a captain shouted somewhere nearby. Technicians rushed toward the communication room while officers spread through corridors searching for intruders. Edward already knew they would find nothing. Mercer operated differently. Like smoke moving through cracks in reality itself. Lena and Edward reached the stairwell leading toward the lower evidence floors. The laughter sounded louder there. Why here? Lena whispered. Edward listened carefully. Beneath the distorted echo of Mercer's voice he heard another sound. Water dripping slowly. Underground pipes. Empty space. Basement, he muttered. They descended cautiously while red emergency lights painted the walls like dried blood. Edward's heartbeat accelerated with every step downward. Something felt wrong beneath the station. Ancient. Waiting. At the bottom level they found a steel security door hanging partially open. Beyond it stretched a narrow maintenance tunnel most officers probably never noticed existed. Damp air drifted outward carrying the smell of rust and stagnant water. Mercer's voice echoed from somewhere deep inside. You're close now, Edward. Lena drew her pistol. Tell me you've been here before. I haven't. Yet the tunnel felt strangely familiar. As if part of him already remembered it. They moved carefully through darkness while leaking pipes dripped overhead. Old electrical wires tangled along the walls like dead vines. The city above felt impossibly far away now. Edward noticed symbols painted faintly across the concrete. Circles intersecting strange geometric lines. Dates written repeatedly in black paint. Tomorrow's date among them. Then another. And another stretching decades backward. Lena touched one of the painted symbols. Cult stuff. Edward shook his head slowly. No. Then what? Before he could answer, the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber hidden beneath the station foundations. Lena stopped breathing for a moment. Edward nearly did too. The room resembled an abandoned church built beneath the city itself. Concrete pillars rose toward darkness overhead. Hundreds of clocks covered the walls. Pocket watches. Alarm clocks. Broken digital clocks frozen at different times. Some ticked normally. Others moved backward. Candles flickered between them casting unstable shadows across the chamber. At the center stood Daniel Mercer wearing the same gray coat from Monroe Station. He looked calm. Almost relieved. Welcome, he said softly. Lena raised her pistol immediately. Hands where I can see them. Mercer ignored her completely. His eyes remained fixed on Edward. You came faster than expected. Edward stared around the chamber. What is this place? Mercer smiled faintly. A sanctuary. For what? For people like us. Edward's stomach tightened. There are more. There were more. Mercer's expression darkened slightly. Most are dead now. Lena stepped closer with the pistol steady in her hands. You orchestrated the subway attack. The sniper. The blackout. Start talking before I arrest you. Mercer finally looked at her. Genuine pity crossed his face. You still believe this is about crime? Then he turned back toward Edward. Tell me. Have you started hearing voices between visions yet? Edward remained silent. Mercer nodded as if silence confirmed everything. Good. That means the door is opening. What door? Mercer gestured toward the clocks surrounding them. Time is not supposed to bend around human minds. But sometimes it tears. Small fractures. Small accidents. People like us fall through those fractures and glimpse what comes next. Edward's pulse pounded violently. You're insane. Mercer laughed softly. No. Insane people think they control the future. We are only infected by it. Lena moved closer. Enough. Mercer ignored her again. Do you know why your visions changed after Monroe Station? Edward said nothing. Because you altered a convergence point. Mercer stepped slowly through the candlelight. Some events matter more than others. Certain moments connect thousands of futures together. When you changed one, something noticed. Edward felt fear rising inside him again. What noticed? Mercer stopped beside one of the clocks. It displayed 11:17 p.m. though Edward checked his watch and saw it was only 9:42. Tomorrow, Mercer whispered. The chamber suddenly trembled. Several clocks fell from the walls and shattered across the floor. Lena aimed her pistol directly at Mercer's chest. Last chance. Mercer looked almost amused. You still think bullets matter here? Then Edward heard it. Footsteps behind them inside the tunnel. Slow. Uneven. Lena turned instantly toward the sound. A figure emerged from darkness wearing a black raincoat. Edward's blood froze because the face beneath the hood belonged to him. Older. Pale. Eyes hollow with exhaustion. The older Edward stared directly at him and spoke with a broken voice. You have to kill Mercer before midnight. Lena stepped backward in horror. What the hell is happening? The older Edward ignored her completely. If he survives tonight, he told Edward, Thursday never ends. Nobody moved for several endless seconds. Candlelight trembled across the underground chamber while hundreds of clocks continued ticking out of rhythm around them. Lena's pistol shifted uncertainly between Mercer and the older version of Edward standing in the tunnel entrance. Edward himself could barely breathe. Seeing the future in fragments was one thing. Seeing himself alive, older, exhausted, physically standing in front of him shattered every remaining rule his mind depended on. The older Edward looked terrible. His hair was streaked with gray. Deep scars crossed his neck and jawline. Dark circles hollowed his eyes so severely he resembled a man who had not slept in years. But the worst part was his expression. Absolute hopelessness. The face of someone who had already watched the world end and failed to stop it. Impossible, Edward whispered. The older Edward laughed weakly. That word stopped meaning anything a long time ago. Mercer remained strangely calm. You shouldn't have come back here, he said softly toward the older Edward. I didn't come back for you. Older Edward kept his eyes locked on his younger self. I came for him. Lena stepped sideways carefully, trying to keep both men in sight. Someone tell me what's happening right now. Older Edward finally glanced toward her. Pain crossed his face instantly. You're supposed to be dead already. Lena tightened her grip on the pistol. Not helpful. Edward forced himself to speak. You said Thursday never ends. Older Edward nodded slowly. Tomorrow night. Midnight. Mercer opens the breach completely. Edward frowned. The breach. Mercer sighed as if disappointed by a student failing an obvious lesson. Language always fails when describing things beyond time. Older Edward ignored him. The visions aren't random, he told Edward urgently. They're pressure leaks. Tiny fractures between moments. Every time we look ahead, the fracture widens. Edward stared at him in disbelief. You're saying I caused this? Partly. No, Mercer interrupted calmly. Not caused. Accelerated. Lena looked ready to lose patience completely. Can either of you speak like normal human beings? Older Edward stepped into the chamber light fully now. Edward noticed dried blood on the older version's hands. 3 years from now, older Edward said quietly, Chicago becomes the center of something catastrophic. Time stops behaving correctly. People relive hours repeatedly. Others vanish between seconds. Entire neighborhoods become trapped inside loops. Lena stared at him. That's insane. I know. Older Edward's voice cracked slightly. I lived through it. Edward shook his head violently. No. This can't be real. It is. Older Edward stepped closer. And it starts tomorrow night unless Mercer dies. Silence fell across the chamber. Mercer looked almost amused by the accusation. Interesting how quickly humans choose murder once frightened enough. Lena slowly lowered the pistol a few inches. Why would killing him stop this? Older Edward answered immediately. Because he's the anchor. Mercer smiled faintly. That's a dramatic way to describe it. Edward's head pounded. None of this felt real anymore. Time fractures. Future selves. Endless Thursdays. Yet deep inside, beneath the terror, another feeling emerged. Recognition. As if some hidden part of him already knew this nightmare was true. Mercer walked slowly toward one of the clocks hanging crookedly from a pillar. Do you know why 11:17 matters? He asked quietly. Edward swallowed hard. No. Mercer touched the clock gently. Because that was the exact moment the first fracture appeared. Lena frowned. When? Mercer looked directly at Edward. 20 years ago. Edward's stomach turned cold instantly. 20 years ago was when the visions began. You remember the storm, Mercer continued softly. The blackout. Your mother screaming downstairs. Edward felt the chamber spin around him. Memories he had buried for years surfaced violently. Rain smashing against windows. Electrical fire in the hallway. A strange sound beneath the thunder, almost like glass cracking inside the sky itself. Then waking the next morning with knowledge of things that had not happened yet. Mercer nodded slowly as realization spread across Edward's face. You were there when the fracture opened. Older Edward stepped forward angrily. Stop talking to him like he chose this. Mercer's expression darkened slightly. None of us chose it. Then every clock in the chamber stopped ticking at once. Silence crashed through the room so suddenly it hurt Edward's ears. Mercer looked upward immediately. Fear crossed his face for the first time. No, he whispered. The candles flickered violently. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Lena raised the pistol again. What now? Older Edward's voice became urgent. It found us. Edward felt something change in the air. Pressure. Like the atmosphere itself had begun folding inward. One by one the stopped clocks began turning toward him. Not physically. But impossibly. Every clock face now displayed exactly the same time. 11:17, then the hand started moving backward. Faster. 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 The chamber trembled violently. Concrete cracked overhead. Lena stumbled backward. What is this? Mercer looked directly at Edward with genuine terror in his eyes now. Run. The shadows behind the pillars began moving independently from the candlelight. Shapes twisted inside them. Human silhouettes bending at impossible angles. Whispering voices filled the chamber from every direction at once. Edward heard fragments clearly. His own voice. His mother's voice. Screams from people not born yet. Older Edward grabbed Edward's arm hard. Listen to me carefully, he said. When midnight comes tomorrow, you cannot look ahead anymore. No visions. No interference. If you open the fracture again, everything repeats. Edward barely heard him because one of the shadows detached completely from the wall and stepped into the candlelight. It wore Edward's face too. But this version was smiling. And its eyes were completely black. The thing wearing Edward's face moved with unnatural slowness, as if walking through invisible water. Candlelight bent strangely around it. Its black eyes reflected no light at all, only endless depth like holes carved through reality itself. Lena instinctively fired first. The gunshot exploded through the underground chamber. The bullet struck the creature directly between the eyes. Nothing happened. No blood. No wound. The thing simply tilted its head slightly while smiling wider. Then the bullet fell from its forehead and clinked harmlessly onto the concrete floor. Lena stared in disbelief. Nope, she whispered under her breath. The chamber shook violently again. Clocks ripped themselves from the walls and shattered around them like falling glass rain. Edward could barely process what he was seeing because some horrifying instinct inside him recognized the creature immediately. Not from memory. From possibility. It was him. Or something born from him. Mercer backed away slowly toward the far side of the chamber. For the first time since Edward met him, the professor looked genuinely afraid. It crossed earlier than expected, Mercer muttered. Older Edward pulled a knife from inside his coat and shoved Lena backward. Get behind the pillars. What is that thing? Older Edward's eyes never left the creature. A future that learned how to survive. The black-eyed version of Edward smiled calmly. You always explain things so dramatically. Its voice sounded wrong. Multiple voices layered together beneath Edward's own tone. Male. Female. Young. Elderly. Thousands speaking through one mouth. Edward felt nausea rise instantly. What are you? He whispered. The creature looked at him with almost affectionate curiosity. You already know. Then suddenly it moved. One moment it stood across the chamber. The next it appeared directly in front of Mercer. Faster than human sight. Mercer gasped as the creature wrapped one hand around his throat and lifted him effortlessly off the ground. Lena fired 3 more shots. Pointless. Older Edward lunged forward with the knife, but the creature threw Mercer aside and caught older Edward by the wrist mid-attack. Bones cracked loudly. Older Edward screamed. Edward finally snapped out of paralysis and rushed forward instinctively. Stop. The creature froze. Slowly it turned toward him. Its smile widened further. There you are. Edward stopped moving immediately because something inside the creature's gaze reached into him like cold fingers sliding beneath skin. Visions exploded behind his eyes. Cities empty beneath dark skies. Airplanes frozen motionless in clouds. People trapped repeating the same conversations endlessly while aging rapidly between sentences. Lena bleeding to death beside a crashed car. Older Edward hanging from chains inside a room full of clocks. And the black-eyed creature standing above it all wearing Edward's face forever. Edward collapsed to one knee gasping. The visions vanished instantly. The creature crouched beside him almost gently. You see now. Edward forced himself to breathe. You're not me. Not yet. Mercer struggled painfully across the floor trying to stand again. Don't listen to it, he coughed. The creature sighed with irritation. Daniel still believes this can be prevented. It rose slowly and looked around the chamber. Humans fear broken time because they mistake linearity for safety. Lena dragged older Edward behind a pillar while trying to stop blood pouring from his shattered wrist. You got any useful information besides cryptic nonsense? She hissed. Older Edward grimaced in pain. If it touches him again we lose. Edward stared upward at the creature. What do you want? The black-eyed version smiled. Freedom. From what? From tomorrow. Edward shook his head weakly. That doesn't mean anything. The creature walked slowly through the falling candlelight. Humans experience time as prisoners. 1 second after another. Cause. Effect. Birth. Death. But the fracture showed me something greater. It touched one of the stopped clocks gently. Everything exists at once. Mercer forced himself upright against a pillar. You're not enlightened, he spat. You're infected. The creature laughed softly. Same difference. Then all the clocks in the chamber suddenly began ticking forward again. Loudly. Violently. Hundreds of ticking sounds overlapping into unbearable noise. Edward grabbed his head. So did Lena. Even Mercer stumbled. Only the creature remained calm. Midnight approaches, it whispered happily. Older Edward looked toward Edward desperately. You have to understand something. Edward struggled to focus on him through the overwhelming noise. That thing isn't a monster from another dimension. It's what happens when you keep looking too far ahead. Edward felt cold terror spread through him. No. Yes. Older Edward's voice broke slightly. Every vision changes us. Every interference pulls pieces of the future backward into the present. Eventually there's not enough human left. The creature smiled proudly. Evolution always frightens weaker versions. Lena helped older Edward stand. Can it be killed? Mercer answered quietly. Probably. Everyone turned toward him. He wiped blood from his mouth and pointed toward the center of the chamber where a rusted metal hatch sat embedded in the floor beneath dozens of broken clocks. The fracture is underneath us. Edward frowned. Underneath. Mercer nodded. When the storm happened 20 years ago, something opened below the city. Small at first. But every vision fed it. The creature's smile disappeared slightly. Careful, Daniel. Mercer ignored it. If the fracture closes, it dies. Older Edward's expression hardened instantly. And probably us too. Silence followed. Lena looked between all of them with exhausted disbelief. Fantastic. Love those odds. The creature began walking slowly toward the hatch now. Shadows twisted around its feet unnaturally. You still don't understand, it said calmly. The fracture cannot be closed anymore. Edward forced himself upright. Why? The creature stopped directly above the hatch and looked at him with black endless eyes. Because tomorrow already came through. Then the metal hatch beneath its feet began opening from the inside. The hatch opened slowly with a scream of rusted metal that echoed through the underground chamber like an animal dying in darkness. Cold air burst upward from below carrying a smell Edward could not describe. Not decay. Not chemicals. Something older. Like rain falling on stone untouched for centuries. Everyone instinctively stepped backward except the black-eyed creature wearing Edward's face. It stood calmly above the widening opening as shadows curled around its body like smoke drawn toward invisible gravity. Beneath the hatch there was no ladder. No tunnel. Only darkness. Endless and depthless. Edward stared into it and immediately felt dizzy because his eyes could not understand what they were seeing. The space below did not behave normally. Distances shifted. Shapes flickered. For brief moments Edward thought he saw entire city streets buried impossibly far beneath the chamber. Then oceans. Then stars. Then the reflection of his own apartment window from 20 years earlier. Lena looked away first. Jesus Christ. Mercer stepped toward the opening carefully despite the fear in his face. It's larger now. Older Edward laughed bitterly. You think? The black-eyed version smiled faintly. You spent your lives fearing this moment while I spent mine preparing for it. Edward kept staring into the breach despite every instinct warning him not to. Whispers drifted upward from the darkness below. Thousands of voices overlapping. Some crying. Some laughing. Some begging. Then Edward heard one voice clearly above the others. His mother. Edward, she whispered softly from the darkness. His blood froze. She had been dead for 13 years. The black-eyed creature watched his reaction carefully. Time does not separate the dead from the living inside the fracture. Edward stepped backward immediately. That's not her. No, older Edward agreed harshly. It only uses memories. Mercer crouched near the edge of the opening, studying symbols carved around the hatch itself. The seal is collapsing faster than expected. Lena looked exhausted. Can someone finally explain what we actually do now? Mercer pointed toward the darkness below. We close it. How? Mercer hesitated. I'm still working on that part. Lena stared at him in disbelief. You started all this without a plan. I didn't start it. Mercer's voice sharpened suddenly. I tried to contain it. The chamber trembled again. Concrete dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere far above, the city groaned like metal bending beneath enormous pressure. Edward heard faint car alarms echoing through the streets overhead. The fracture was spreading. The black-eyed creature extended one hand toward the breach almost lovingly. You feel it too, don't you? Edward hated that the answer was yes. Beneath the fear and confusion, another sensation existed. Attraction. The fracture called to him. Not with words. With understanding. Every lonely year of his life. Every sleepless night. Every vision. All of it connected somehow to the darkness below. Don't listen, older Edward warned instantly. That's how it starts. Edward tore his eyes away from the breach. What happens at midnight? Older Edward looked toward the opening grimly. The barrier finishes collapsing. Mercer nodded slowly. After that, cause and effect stop behaving correctly near the fracture. Lena rubbed both hands across her face. You people keep saying things that sound intelligent until I think about them for more than 2 seconds. The black-eyed creature laughed softly. Linear minds always struggle at the edge of infinity. Lena raised the pistol again. I am 1 sentence away from shooting everybody in this room. Then suddenly every clock in the chamber jumped forward simultaneously. 11:43 p.m. Edward's stomach tightened. Time was accelerating. Mercer noticed it too. No. Older Edward cursed under his breath. It's pulling midnight closer. The black-eyed version smiled wider. Of course it is. The breach below them expanded slightly. Darkness spilled outward across the concrete floor like liquid shadow. Wherever it touched, reality distorted. One fallen clock aged into rust within seconds. A nearby pillar briefly appeared cracked and ruined before snapping back normal again. Lena stumbled backward. Okay. I officially believe all of this now. Edward's head suddenly exploded with another vision. Stronger than ever before. He saw Chicago at midnight. Streets empty beneath frozen snowfall. People standing motionless mid-step while shadows moved independently around them. He saw Lena trapped inside a police car screaming soundlessly. Mercer kneeling before the breach with blood pouring from his eyes. Older Edward burning alive beneath a sky filled with stopped airplanes. Then Edward saw himself standing beside the black-eyed creature willingly. Smiling. The vision shattered violently. Edward gasped and nearly fell. The creature watched him knowingly. You finally saw the real future. Edward shook his head. No. Yes. Its voice softened almost sympathetically. You stop fighting eventually. Older Edward grabbed Edward's shoulders hard. Listen to me carefully. The visions lie. Edward stared at him. You just told me they were real. They are, older Edward said desperately. But once the fracture widens, possibilities start mixing together. It shows futures that want to happen. Mercer suddenly stood upright. Wait. Everyone looked toward him. He stared at Edward intensely now. When did the visions begin exactly? Edward frowned. I told you. During the storm 20 years ago. Mercer shook his head slowly. No. I mean the first actual vision. Edward tried remembering. Rain. Darkness. Fear. Then something surfaced from deep memory. A face. A smiling face with black eyes leaning toward him through darkness. Edward's blood turned cold instantly. Mercer saw the realization happen. It contacted you first, he whispered. The creature smiled proudly. Children are easier to shape. Older Edward stepped backward in horror. No. Edward felt the entire chamber spinning around him. You mean this thing caused everything? Not caused, the creature corrected gently. Invited. Then the breach below them began glowing faintly. Deep inside the darkness, something enormous started moving upward toward the chamber. The glow rising from the breach was not light in any normal sense. It pulsed beneath the darkness like veins carrying liquid silver through a living wound. The entire chamber vibrated now. Concrete cracked across the walls. Candles extinguished themselves one by one as if suffocated by invisible hands. Edward could hear the city above groaning louder every second. Sirens screamed somewhere far overhead, twisting unnaturally in pitch as reality bent around the spreading fracture. Lena steadied herself against a pillar. Tell me that thing coming up has a weakness. Mercer stared into the breach with absolute dread. Everything has a weakness. That wasn't reassuring. Older Edward stepped toward the opening carefully despite the pain in his shattered wrist. It's waking up sooner than before. Edward looked at him sharply. Before. Older Edward closed his eyes briefly. This isn't the first time midnight happened. Silence crashed through the chamber harder than the tremors themselves. Edward felt cold spread through his chest. What? The black-eyed creature smiled with genuine delight now. Finally. Older Edward looked exhausted beyond words. The loop started 3 years from now in my timeline. At first they were small. Minutes repeating. Conversations happening twice. People forgetting entire hours. Then the fracture widened. He stared toward the darkness below. Eventually midnight stopped ending. Lena frowned. You mean a time loop? Not exactly. Older Edward swallowed hard. Imagine the world continuing forward while pieces of it repeat endlessly. Some people trapped. Others aging normally. Entire days folding over each other. Mercer nodded grimly. Temporal collapse. Lena pointed angrily toward the breach. Can we stop naming the apocalypse for 5 seconds and stop it instead? Edward barely heard them. One horrifying detail consumed his thoughts. You said this isn't the first time. Older Edward met his eyes. I've tried to stop tonight before. Edward's pulse froze. How many times? Older Edward hesitated. I don't know anymore. The black-eyed creature laughed softly. 37 for this version. I think. Lena stared at older Edward in disbelief. You've lived this night 37 times. Maybe more. His voice sounded hollow now. The memories blur together eventually. Edward felt sick. And every time we fail. Older Edward looked away silently. That answer was enough. The glow beneath the breach intensified suddenly. Shapes moved within it now. Human silhouettes flickering inside the silver light. Edward saw people walking through the darkness below like reflections trapped underwater. Thousands of them. Some modern. Some wearing clothes from decades earlier. Some staring upward directly at him. The black-eyed creature spread its arms slowly. Do you see it now? Past and future together. No death. No separation. No waiting for tomorrow because all moments exist forever. Mercer's expression twisted with disgust. That isn't eternity. It's decay. Edward suddenly understood something terrifying. The people in the visions. Mercer nodded immediately. Fragments pulled through the fracture. Lena looked overwhelmed. So what exactly comes out at midnight? Nobody answered immediately. Then something moved beneath the silver glow. Massive. Slow. The chamber trembled violently as a shape larger than a building shifted below the opening. Edward could not fully see it. His brain resisted the geometry of it. Angles folding inside themselves. Movement without direction. A presence too enormous for human perception. The black-eyed creature whispered reverently. The first observer. Mercer grabbed Edward suddenly. Listen to me carefully. The fracture is connected to you more strongly than anyone else. If anyone can close it, it's you. Edward stared at him. How? Mercer pointed toward the breach. You must sever the connection. Older Edward's face darkened instantly. He'll die. Mercer answered without hesitation. Probably. Lena stepped between them angrily. Absolutely not. Edward barely noticed her. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness below because something inside it had started whispering directly to him now. Not in language. In memory. Childhood loneliness. Sleepless nights. Fear. Regret. Every painful moment of his life rose inside him like smoke. Then came another feeling. Relief. The fracture offered escape from time itself. No more fearing tomorrow because tomorrow would become meaningless. The black-eyed creature stepped beside Edward almost gently. "You're tired," it whispered. "I know." Edward closed his eyes. God, he was tired. 20 years of visions. 20 years of isolation and terror and helplessness. The creature's voice softened further. "You were never meant to carry linear time alone." Older Edward grabbed Edward's arm hard. "Don't listen." Edward looked at the older version of himself. Really looked at him. The scars. The exhaustion. The hopelessness of a man trapped repeating failure endlessly. "Does it ever get better?" Edward whispered. Older Edward's silence answered everything. The chamber shook again. Above them, the ceiling cracked open slightly, revealing glimpses of the night sky over Chicago. Except the sky was wrong now. Snow hung motionless in the air. Helicopters remained frozen above distant skyscrapers. The city had already begun stopping. Mercer looked upward in horror. Midnight started early. Then every clock in the chamber changed simultaneously. 11:59 p.m. The black-eyed creature smiled wider than ever before. "It's time." The massive thing beneath the breach moved upward again. Closer now. Edward heard countless voices speaking through the silver glow all at once. Then one sentence emerged clearly above the others. "Open your eyes." Edward realized with sudden terror that at some point during the shaking and noise he had closed them tightly. Slowly, against his own will, he began opening them again. And deep within the fracture below, something enormous opened its eyes too. The eyes inside the fracture were larger than buildings. They opened slowly beneath the silver darkness like twin moons rising from a dead ocean. Edward immediately understood why human language failed near the breach. Nothing in the world possessed words large enough for what he was seeing. The thing below was not a creature in the normal sense. It was awareness itself. Ancient. Endless. Watching. The moment its gaze touched him, time stopped completely. Not metaphorically. Literally. Lena froze beside a shattered pillar with her mouth half open. Mercer stood motionless near the breach. Falling dust hung suspended in the air like stars trapped inside glass. Even the trembling chamber became perfectly still. Only Edward remained capable of movement. And the black-eyed version of him. The creature smiled softly beside him. "Now you understand." Edward could not breathe properly. His heartbeat sounded impossibly loud inside the frozen silence. "What is it?" The creature looked toward the massive eyes below with something close to worship. The first thing that ever looked forward. Edward stared downward while terror hollowed him from the inside. Images flooded his mind without warning. Primitive humans staring at fire beneath ancient skies. Prophets collapsing from visions they could not control. Scientists driven insane after glimpsing equations that described tomorrow before today existed. Throughout all of history, tiny fractures had appeared around certain minds. Certain moments. And behind every fracture, those eyes waited patiently. Observing humanity, observing time. Edward suddenly understood the true horror. The visions were never a gift. They were contact. The creature touched Edward's shoulder gently. It noticed you when you were a child because you noticed it back. Edward remembered the storm 20 years earlier. The blackout. The impossible cracking sound in the sky. And the face with black eyes leaning toward him from darkness. Not invading. Greeting him. "Why me?" Edward whispered. The creature's smile faded slightly. "Because you were lonely enough to listen." The truth hit harder than fear itself. Edward had spent his entire life believing tomorrow cursed him randomly. But the fracture chose damaged people. Isolated people. Minds already disconnected from the world around them. The eyes below watched silently while understanding spread through Edward piece by piece. Then the voices began. Millions of whispers pouring upward from the breach all at once. Some begged for help. Others laughed. Others repeated the same final moments endlessly like recordings trapped in broken machines. Edward heard every possible future overlapping together. Every death. Every birth. Every regret humanity ever carried. The noise became unbearable. He dropped to his knees covering his ears. "Make it stop." The black-eyed creature crouched beside him calmly. "You can." Edward looked up weakly. "How?" "Accept it." Older Edward suddenly moved. Somehow. Against the frozen world. Blood ran from his nose and eyes as he forced himself forward through stop time itself. "Don't," he gasped painfully. The effort of movement seemed to tear his body apart. The creature watched him with pity. "You always resist." Older Edward grabbed Edward's coat desperately. "Listen to me." His voice trembled violently now. "I finally remembered something." Edward stared at him. "What?" Older Edward smiled sadly. The loops were never punishment. The creature's expression darkened slightly. Older Edward continued speaking quickly before it could interrupt. "Every time midnight came, you tried saving everyone. Every single time. That's why the world kept breaking." Edward frowned weakly. "I don't understand." Older Edward's eyes filled with exhausted grief. "The fracture feeds on interference. On fear of tomorrow. Every attempt to control fate widens it further." Edward looked toward the enormous eyes below. Then realization struck him like lightning. The visions. Older Edward nodded. "It needed you addicted to them." The black-eyed creature rose slowly. "Hope is such a fragile illness." Edward stood unsteadily now. His mind raced through 20 years of memories. Every warning. Every interference. Every desperate attempt to outsmart tomorrow. The fracture had grown stronger each time because Edward kept looking ahead, searching for certainty. Searching for control. Mercer suddenly moved too, barely able to speak against the frozen world. "Close your eyes," he whispered. Edward looked at him. "What?" "That's the answer." Mercer coughed blood onto the motionless floor. "Stop looking." The creature laughed softly. Too late. But Edward finally understood. The future only held power because he kept reaching toward it. Feeding it attention. Fear. Obsession. Tomorrow ruled his life because he never allowed himself to live inside today. The massive eyes beneath the breach widened further, sensing his realization. The whispers became furious. The black-eyed creature stepped closer urgently now. "You can't escape awareness." Edward looked directly at it. For the first time, he no longer felt fear. Only exhaustion. "No," he said quietly. "But I can stop worshipping it." Then Edward closed his eyes. Completely. The whispers exploded into screams instantly. The chamber shook violently again. The creature grabbed Edward's shoulders desperately. "Look at me." Edward refused. Around him the frozen world began cracking like thin ice beneath enormous pressure. He heard Mercer shouting something. Lena screaming. The monstrous sound rising from the breach below. But Edward kept his eyes shut. No visions. No tomorrow. No fear. For the first time since childhood, he allowed uncertainty to exist without reaching toward it. The fracture began collapsing immediately. The screams from below became deafening. The creature's grip weakened. "You don't understand," it hissed. "Without tomorrow you're nothing." Edward smiled faintly in darkness. "Maybe." Then came light. Not from the breach. From everywhere. Warm sunlight against closed eyelids. Wind. Silence. Edward slowly opened his eyes. Morning. He stood alone on a Chicago sidewalk while people moved normally around him. Cars passed. Birds crossed the sky. No frozen snow. No distorted shadows. No breach tearing through reality beneath the city. His watch read 8:14 a.m. Friday morning. Edward breathed carefully. The world felt real again. Fragile. Temporary. Uncertain. Human. A woman brushed past him holding a yellow balloon beside a laughing little girl. Edward watched them disappear into the crowd safely. Then he noticed something strange. For the first time in 20 years, he had no idea what would happen next. And somehow, that felt like freedom.